Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way to this quiet corner of the internet where we explore ancient stories and let them carry us gently into rest. Go ahead and get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Pull your blankets up just the way you like them. Let your body sink a little deeper into your bed. There's nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to do. Just listen. And if you drift away at any point, that's exactly what this is for. Tonight, we're going on a journey together. But it's not the kind of journey you need to stay awake for. In fact, the more relaxed you become, the better. Let the words wash over you like waves. Some will register clearly. Others will fade into the background as sleep finds you, and that's perfect. Have you ever looked at those paintings of biblical prophets? You know the ones. Dramatic robes flowing in impossible wind. Glowing skin. Perfect beards. A staff in hand, standing on a picturesque mountain as the sun sets behind them in brilliant oranges and purples. Maybe there's a gentle deer nearby, or a stream of crystal clear water. It all looks so peaceful, so mystical, so honestly kind of appealing in a spiritual retreat sort of way. But here's what those paintings don't show you. They don't show the cracked, bleeding lips from dehydration, the gaunt face with ribs showing through sun-darkened skin, the matted hair full of dust and twigs, the haunted eyes that haven't seen another human being in weeks, the flies constantly swarming around your face, the infected wounds on your feet from walking barefoot across scorching rocks, the way your hands shake from hunger. The predator tracks around where you slept last night. Tonight, we're going to explore what it would actually be like if you were called to be a prophet in the wilderness. Not the romanticized version, the real version. The version where you'd be trying to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, with no resources, no support, no backup plan, and a message from God that nobody wants to hear. We'll walk through your first night sleeping on stone. We'll feel the hunger that becomes your constant companion. We'll search desperately for water. We'll face the predators that see you as prey. We'll experience the crushing loneliness that breaks even the strongest people. And we'll understand why these prophets looked the way they did, why they acted the way they did, and why their messages carried such weight. This isn't meant to be disturbing. It's meant to be real, because when we understand what these people actually endured, their words mean so much more. Their courage becomes staggering. Their faith becomes, well, almost incomprehensible. And after we've walked through this wilderness experience together, we'll spend some time with 3 specific prophets. We'll sit with Elijah in his depression cave after his greatest victory turned into his darkest moment. We'll be with John the Baptist in his final days in Herod's dungeon, going from wilderness freedom to underground death. And we'll follow Moses through those 40 years in Midian that nobody talks about. The decades of preparation that transformed a palace prince into the shepherd who could lead a nation. Take another deep breath. Feel your shoulders dropping, your jaw loosening, your breathing slowing down. You don't need to remember every detail of what comes next. You don't need to stay awake for all of it. This story will be here, unfolding gently, whether you hear every word or drift away after the next few minutes. Let's begin. You're living an ordinary life. Maybe you're a shepherd like Moses was. Maybe you're a farmer. Maybe you work with your hands, building things or repairing them. You know your trade. You know your routine. You wake up, you work, you eat, you sleep. There's comfort in the predictability, safety in the familiar. And then it happens. It's different for everyone, but there's always a moment when everything changes. For Moses, it was a bush that burned but wasn't consumed. For Isaiah, it was a vision in the temple, seraphim with 6 wings crying, "Holy, holy, holy," and the whole building shaking. For Ezekiel, it was the heavens opening and creatures with 4 faces appearing in wheels within wheels. For Jeremiah, it was simply the word of the Lord coming to him, though he was just a youth. But however it comes, when God speaks, there's no mistaking it for your own thoughts. It's not a gentle suggestion. It's not something you can shrug off or ignore. It's a presence that fills everything, that makes your own breathing seem loud, that makes you suddenly, terrifyingly aware that you are standing before something infinite and you are very, very small. Your body responds before your mind does. You might fall to your knees. You might hide your face. You might try to run, though your legs won't work properly. Your heart hammers in your chest. Some people describe it as feeling like you're going to die, not from fear exactly, but because something in you knows that human beings aren't meant to encounter the divine directly. We're too fragile, too finite, like trying to contain the ocean in a clay cup. And then comes the message, the calling, the assignment you never asked for. Go to Pharaoh and bring my people out of Egypt? Moses, who killed a man and ran away, who's been hiding in the desert for 40 years, who stutters when he speaks. Go, tell this people ... double quotes Isaiah, being sent with a message that he's told in advance the people won't accept. Stand in the courtyard of the Lord's house and speak to all the people ... double quotes Jeremiah, young and inexperienced, being sent to tell kings and nations what they don't want to hear. You want to say no. You list all the reasons you're not qualified. Moses does this. He argues with God, gives excuse after excuse. Who am I? What if they don't believe me? I'm slow of speech. Jeremiah does it too. I'm too young. I don't know how to speak. But God doesn't take no for an answer. The calling is the calling. I will be with you. That's the promise. Not it will be easy. Not you'll be successful. Not people will like you. Just I will be with you. And somehow, impossibly, you say yes. Or maybe you don't say yes with words. Maybe you just stop saying no. Maybe you just start walking in the direction you're being sent, 1 foot in front of the other, because something in you knows you don't really have a choice. Not because God is forcing you, but because once you've heard that voice, once you've seen that vision, everything else becomes impossible. Going back to your ordinary life would be like trying to forget you can breathe. The calling becomes part of you, branded into your soul. So you prepare to leave, except there's nothing to prepare. What do you pack for a journey into the wilderness with no destination date? What do you tell your family? Your wife, if you have one, looks at you like you've lost your mind. Maybe you have. Maybe prophets and madmen look the same from the outside. You eat your last meal at a table. You sleep your last night on a mat in a home with walls. You feel the weight of a roof over your head and try to memorize the sensation because you don't know when you'll feel it again. Your relatives gather, some are crying, some are angry. This is foolishness, they say. You have responsibilities here. A family, work. How will you eat? Where will you go? And you have no good answers because the answers sound insane. God told me to go into the wilderness. I'm supposed to deliver a message. I don't know how long I'll be gone. They look at you with pity or judgment or fear, maybe all three. When the sun rises, you walk away. You don't look back, not because you're strong, but because if you look back, you might not be able to keep walking, and you have to keep walking. One step, then another. The settlement grows smaller behind you. The sounds of normal life fade. Voices, laughter, dogs barking, chickens clucking, the rhythmic sound of someone grinding grain. All of it fading, gone. And then there's just you. The wilderness stretching out ahead, the sky impossibly large, the silence pressing in on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. You are leaving everything you know for ... what exactly? A word from God and a staff in your hand. That's all you have. By midday you're thirsty. Your water skin is already half empty, and you're rationing carefully, but the sun is merciless. It beats down on your head, on your shoulders, and you start to understand that this heat isn't like working in a field near home where you could always go inside, find shade, drink whenever you wanted. This heat is everywhere, relentless, oppressive. The air itself feels hot when you breathe it in. By evening, you're exhausted. Your feet hurt in ways they never have before. The sandals you wore seemed sturdy enough this morning, but the terrain here is different, sharper, rockier. Your soles are bruised. You might have blisters forming. And then the sun starts to set. The sky turns colors you've never seen before, brilliant purples and deep oranges, and in any other circumstance you'd find it beautiful. But right now, you're just thinking about what comes next. Darkness. Your first night in the wilderness, alone. You need to find shelter. Fast. The temperature starts dropping the moment the sun touches the horizon. It's shocking how fast it happens. 20 minutes ago, you were sweating, wiping your brow, wishing for relief from the heat. Now you're pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders, and it's not enough. You're scanning the landscape, looking for anything that could serve as shelter. A cave would be ideal, but caves are rare and usually already occupied by animals, by insects, by things you'd rather not think about. An overhang of rock? You spot one in the distance and walk toward it, hurrying now because the light is fading fast. No gradual twilight here in the desert. The sun is there, and then it's not, and then you're stumbling over rocks you can't see. You reach the overhang just as darkness settles completely. It's not much, maybe 10 feet deep, barely high enough to sit up in, but it blocks the wind, and there is wind. Suddenly there's so much wind. It howls across the open desert and slams against the rocks, finding every gap, every opening, every space where it can reach you. The temperature has dropped 30, maybe 40 degrees. Your sweat-soaked tunic, which felt unbearable in the afternoon, is now clammy and cold against your skin. You crouch under the overhang and try to arrange yourself. The ground is hard. Not hard like a floor, hard like stone, because it is stone. Sharp edges everywhere. You try to find a relatively flat spot. Use your hands to sweep away the worst of the gravel, the loose rocks. You pull your cloak around you, but it's not thick enough for this cold. You're shivering within minutes. You try lying on your side. A rock digs into your hip. You shift. Now a different rock is pressing into your shoulder. You roll onto your back, but that's worse, your spine resting directly on stone, your head on a surface that might as well be concrete. You fold part of your cloak to make a pillow, but it's barely an inch thick. The back of your skull aches within minutes. And then the sounds start. During the day, the wilderness had its noises wind, your own footsteps, maybe a bird. But night in the wilderness is a completely different auditory experience. It's not quiet. It's full of sounds you don't recognize and can't identify. Something scuttles across rocks nearby. Could be a lizard. Could be a scorpion. Could be something worse. In the distance, an animal howls. It's high-pitched, eerie, and it goes on for several seconds before trailing off into yips and barks. Jackals. You've heard about them. Medium-sized scavengers that run in packs. They rarely attack healthy humans, but they're curious. They investigate, and they can smell you from miles away. The howl comes again, closer this time. Or maybe it's a different jackal. Maybe there are several. You can't tell. You pull your cloak tighter and press yourself further back against the rock wall. Your staff is in your hand, a piece of wood that suddenly feels inadequate. What would you even do if a pack of jackals approached? Wave the stick at them? Hope they're frightened by a man huddled in the dark? Another sound. Rocks shifting, tumbling down a slope somewhere to your left. Something big made that sound. Something heavy. Your mind races through possibilities. A leopard? They lived in these regions. Syrian brown bears. They were around, too, especially in the north. Your throat goes dry. You hold very still, barely breathing, listening. The sound doesn't repeat. Whatever it was has moved on. Or it's waiting. Or it was never an animal at all. Just rocks settling naturally in the cooling temperature. You tell yourself that, but you don't believe it. Your eyes adjust slowly to the darkness. Not that there's much to see. The moon isn't up yet, and the stars, while brilliant, don't provide enough light to see detail. Just shapes. Shadows. Your imagination fills in the rest, and your imagination is not your friend right now. Every shadow could be moving. Every shape could be crouched. Watching. You try to pray. You try to remember why you're here, what you're called to do. I will be with you, God said. You're holding on to those words like a rope in a flood. But right now, in this moment, you feel completely alone. The presence you felt so strongly when you received the call seems distant now. Maybe you imagined it. Maybe you're just a fool who walked away from safety and comfort for a delusion. Your body aches. Your hip bone is bruising from the rock beneath it. Your shoulder throbs. Your feet are swollen from walking, and you can feel blisters that have formed and burst. The cold has seeped into your joints. You've never been so uncomfortable in your entire life, and this is just the first night. The first of hundreds, maybe thousands. You must fall asleep at some point, though you're not sure when. It's not real sleep, not the deep, restorative kind. It's the fitful dozing of someone who's too uncomfortable and too alert to fully rest. You drift in and out. Dream fragments mix with reality. You're back home. No, you're here. You hear your wife's voice. No, that's just the wind. You feel warmth. No, you're freezing. When your eyes open again, the sky has changed. There's a hint of gray on the eastern horizon. Dawn is coming. You've survived the night. You try to sit up and your body screams in protest. Everything hurts. Your muscles have stiffened from the cold and the awkward positions. Your back spasms. Your neck can barely turn. You move like an old man, slow and groaning, though you're not old. You're just broken from one night on stone. You crawl out from under the overhang and stand unsteady. The wind has died down, but the air is still cold. The sun isn't up yet, won't be for another 30 minutes, and you're shivering violently. You try walking in place, swinging your arms, getting blood flowing. It helps a little. The landscape looks different in the early morning light. Less menacing than it did at twilight. More stark, more empty. More honest about what it is. A place where nothing grows easily, where water is scarce, where life clings to existence by sheer stubbornness. You drink from your water skin. The water is nearly gone. You'll need to find more today. The hunger you felt yesterday has intensified into a sharp, cramping pain. You haven't eaten since when? Yesterday morning? The day before? Time is already starting to blur. You look back toward the direction you came from. Somewhere miles away now is civilization, homes, food, beds, people, safety. You could walk back. You could say you tried. You could return to your ordinary life. But you don't, because the call is still there, quiet but insistent, like a compass needle pointing north. You don't even fully understand where you're going or why, but you start walking anyway. And as you walk, the sun breaks over the horizon, and the temperature starts to climb, and you realize with a sinking feeling in your stomach, tonight you'll have to do this all over again. Find shelter, fight the cold, battle your mind through the dark hours, and the night after that, you wouldn't last a day, most people wouldn't, but somehow prophets lasted years. It starts as a manageable discomfort, an awareness that you haven't eaten, your stomach growls. You think about food, bread, olives, cheese, things you took for granted. But it's not unbearable yet, just annoying. By the second day, it's harder to ignore. The hunger has teeth now. It gnaws at you from the inside. Your stomach cramps, you feel weak, lightheaded. Your thoughts keep circling back to food, memories of meals, the smell of bread baking, the taste of lentil stew, the simple pleasure of chewing and swallowing. But there is no food, not the kind you're used to. The wilderness doesn't have storehouses or markets or even generous neighbors who might share. The wilderness has what it has, and if you want to eat, you need to find it yourself. So you start looking, and you quickly discover that finding food in the desert is almost a full-time job. You're not just hungry, you're constantly searching, scanning, hoping. You develop a kind of hyper-awareness. Your eyes scan every crevice for edible plants. Your ears perk up at any buzzing sound that might indicate bees. You watch where birds fly because they might lead you to water or seeds or something, anything. Let's talk about what prophets actually ate, because this part is crucial to understand. When John the Baptist appeared, the Gospels tell us very specifically what he ate: locusts and wild honey. And most of us read that and think, oh, how interesting, and then we move on. But stop. Actually think about what that means. Locusts first. These are insects. Grasshoppers, technically. They're about 2 to 3 inches long. They have hard exoskeletons, 6 legs, wings, antennae. To eat them, you have to catch them first, which is harder than it sounds because they jump and fly. When you do catch one, it's writhing in your hand, trying to escape. The Jewish law said locusts were clean to eat, one of the few insects that were. So John wasn't breaking any laws, but catching them, killing them, preparing them, This is work. Some people roast them over fire, if they can make fire. The exoskeleton chars, the inside cooks. You pull off the legs and wings because they're not pleasant to eat. And then you put this cricket-like creature in your mouth and you bite down. There's a crunch. The texture is, well, it's not like anything else. Crispy outside, softer inside. The taste is bitter, earthy, with a slight nuttiness. If you're being generous in your description. Protein, yes. Sustaining, yes. Pleasant, not particularly. You eat them because you need to eat, not because you want. And wild honey, that sounds better, right? Honey is good. We like honey, but consider what wild honey means in practice. This isn't honey from a managed beehive in someone's garden. This is honey from bees that have nested in a rock crevice, or a hollow tree, or under an overhang. And these bees are not domesticated. They're not gentle. They're wild, protective, and they have stingers they're very willing to use. To get wild honey, you have to find the nest first. You do this by watching bees, following their flight patterns, which is tedious and time-consuming. Once you find the nest, you have to figure out how to get to it. Often it's in a difficult spot high up, deep in a crevice, surrounded by rocks. Then you have to deal with the bees. Some people use smoke to calm bees, but making fire and smoke requires resources you might not have. Some people just endure the stings, and they do sting, multiple times. Your hands swell, your face swells if you're not careful. The pain is sharp and burning, and it lingers for hours. If you manage to get to the honeycomb, you're pulling it out with your bare hands. It's sticky, messy. Bees are crawling on you, in your hair, on your arms. You're swatting and grabbing and hoping you don't get stung in the eye. You shove honeycomb in your mouth while bees buzz furiously around your head. The honey is sweet, yes, intensely sweet. Maybe the only sweet thing you've tasted in weeks. But it's mixed with wax, with bee parts, with your own desperation. That's wild honey. That's what John ate. Not a neat little jar of filtered, store-bought honey. Raw, wild, hard-won sweetness at the cost of pain and effort. And those were probably his main foods. But there would have been others, depending on the season and location. Wild plants, but you have to know which ones won't kill you. Some desert plants are edible certain roots, certain leaves, certain seeds. But many are poisonous. Eating the wrong plant means stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, possibly death. So you have to know what you're doing, or you have to risk trial and error, which is terrifying. Sometimes there are berries, but they're usually small, tart, barely worth the effort. Sometimes you find birds' eggs if you can reach a nest. Raw eggs, because again, fire isn't always an option. The texture of raw egg white sliding down your throat. The taste of raw yolk, it's not pleasant, but it's protein. Occasionally, if you're near water and very lucky, you might catch a fish with your bare hands or a makeshift trap. Small fish, bony, but food nonetheless. But most days you're eating very little. Maybe a handful of locusts, maybe some bitter leaves, maybe nothing at all. Your body starts to change. The fat melts off first. You probably didn't have much to begin with. Then your muscles begin to break down for energy. Your face becomes gaunt. Your ribs show through your skin. Your arms and legs thin to the point where you look skeletal. Your hands shake. At first just occasionally when you're very hungry. Then more frequently, then almost constantly. Your coordination suffers. Simple tasks become difficult. Your thinking gets fuzzy. You have trouble concentrating, trouble remembering things. You're cold all the time because you don't have enough body fat to insulate you. And the obsession sets in. Food dominates your thoughts. You're thinking about it constantly. When you're walking, you're thinking about food. When you're trying to pray, images of bread keep interrupting. When you try to sleep, you dream about meals, feasts you attended years ago, the smell of roasted meat, the taste of fresh fruit. Your mouth waters in your sleep. You understand, in a way you never did before, why Jesus' temptation in the wilderness began with food. After 40 days of fasting, when Satan said, "Turn these stones into bread," that wasn't a trivial temptation. That was addressing the most consuming, desperate craving imaginable. Bread, simple bread, the ability to eat until you're full, to not feel this gnawing emptiness in your gut, to have energy again, to think clearly again. And Jesus said no, refused, quoted Scripture. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. After 40 days of not eating, that's the kind of strength prophets needed, not just physical strength, but spiritual strength that could override the body's most basic, most insistent demands. Most of us would break. Most of us would give up the calling, walk back to civilization, eat until we were sick, and never go near the wilderness again. The hunger alone would be enough to end our prophetic careers before they began. But prophets stayed. Elijah ate what ravens brought him, and have you thought about that? Ravens are scavengers. They eat carrion, dead things. What exactly were they bringing him? Bread and meat, the text says, but what kind? How old? How clean? Doesn't matter. You eat what God provides when God provides it, and you're grateful. Moses ate manna for 40 years, the same thing, every day for 4 decades. It tasted like wafers with honey, the text says, but imagine eating the identical food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day, for 40 years. The monotony alone would be a kind of torture, but it was better than starving, so the people ate it, and complained about it, and wanted meat, wanted variety, wanted anything different. The prophets who lived in the wilderness learned to survive on almost nothing. They learned which plants wouldn't kill them. They learned patience in hunting or gathering. They learned to go days with minimal food. Their bodies adapted, became efficient, learned to operate on fewer calories. But they never stopped being hungry. Hunger was just the baseline, the constant background noise of their existence. And when they came out of the wilderness and saw people throwing away food, wasting it, complaining about it, it must have been almost unbearable. The disconnect between their experience and normal life was staggering. They'd been starving while others feasted. They'd been grateful for insects while others turned up their noses at elaborate meals. The hunger changed them, made them fierce, made them uncompromising, made them men who couldn't be bought or bribed, because what could you offer someone who'd already survived on nothing? Money? They didn't need it. Fine clothes? Meaningless. A comfortable position? They'd already proven they could live without comfort. The wilderness stripped away everything that didn't matter and left only what did. The call, the message, the word from God that burned in their bones. That's what hunger did to prophets. It refined them like fire refines gold, burning away everything soft, everything comfortable, everything that wasn't absolutely essential. What remained was hard, uncompromising, and impossible to ignore. If hunger is terrible, thirst is worse, because you can survive for weeks without food, but you'll die in 3 days without water, maybe less in the desert heat. Thirst doesn't gradually build like hunger. It comes on fast, and it's immediately critical. Your body is about 60% water. Every cell needs it. Every process depends on it. And in the desert, you're losing water constantly. Through sweat, through breathing dry air, through every bodily function. You need to replace at least a gallon per day, more if you're active, even more if it's particularly hot. A gallon, 8 pounds of water, every single day. And there are no water fountains in the wilderness, no taps, no wells with buckets. There's whatever water you can find, and it's never enough. Let's walk through what happens when you start to get dehydrated, because understanding this helps you understand the absolute desperation of the water search. In the first few hours without water, you feel thirsty. Your mouth gets dry. You're aware you need to drink, but it's manageable. This is normal thirst. By hour 6 or 8, it's intensifying. Your mouth isn't just dry, it's sticky. Your tongue feels thick. Your lips are chapped. You're thinking about water frequently. Your body is starting to conserve. You're not urinating as much. And when you do, it's dark, concentrated. By the end of day 1 without adequate water, you're in trouble. Your mouth is painfully dry. Your tongue is swollen. Swallowing is difficult. Your lips are cracking, starting to bleed. You're dizzy when you stand up. Your heart is racing because your blood volume is decreasing, getting thicker, harder to pump. You have a headache, a pounding, relentless headache. Your skin has lost its elasticity. If you pinch it, it stays tented instead of snapping back. Day 2, you're dying. That's not an exaggeration. Your body is shutting down. You can't produce tears anymore. Your eyes feel gritty, painful. You're not urinating at all. Your kidneys are failing. The headache has become unbearable. You're confused, disoriented. You're seeing things mirages, of course, pools of water that aren't there, but also other hallucinations. Your body temperature is rising because you can't sweat anymore. You're weak, stumbling, barely able to walk. Day 3, if you make it that far, unconsciousness. Then death. It's not peaceful. It's organ failure, brain damage from dehydration, a body that simply can't function without water. So finding water isn't optional. It's the most important task of every single day. You can skip food for a while. You cannot skip water. But where is water in the wilderness? That's the question you're asking from the moment you wake up. Where is water? How far to the next source? Is there enough to fill your water skin? Will it be safe to drink? Sometimes, if you're extraordinarily lucky, there's a spring. Water bubbling up from underground, flowing constantly, clean and cool and pure. These are rare, sacred. In biblical times, springs became meeting places, became property disputes, became centers of settlement because water meant life. If you find a spring in the wilderness, you stay near it as long as you can. You memorize its location. You return to it. More often, you're looking for Wadi's dry riverbeds that only have water when rain falls, which means most of the time they're empty, just sand and rocks. But sometimes, if you know where to look, if you dig down a foot or two in certain spots, you might hit damp sand and wet sand and a little puddle of water seeping up. It's muddy, it's warm, but it's water. You scoop it up with your hands, try to filter it through cloth, and you drink it. Sometimes you're looking for water trapped in rock depressions after a rare rain. These pools get covered with algae quickly. Insects lay eggs in them. Animals drink from them and defecate nearby. But if it's all you can find, you drink it. You try to skim off the surface scum. You try not to think about what might be in it. You just drink. In the early morning, if you're desperate, you can sometimes collect dew. You spread out cloth or your cloak over rocks or bush while it's still dark. Then, in the pre-dawn, you wring out the fabric and catch the drops in your mouth or water skin. It's not much, maybe a few ounces if you're lucky, but a few ounces might keep you alive until you find more. When it rains in the desert, which is rare, unpredictable, it's an event. You hear thunder, see clouds gathering, feel the first drops, and you immediately stop whatever you're doing, and you prepare. You spread out anything that can catch water. You position containers. You stand with your mouth open, arms out, and you let the rain hit you. It's cold, shocking, wonderful. You're drinking as much as you can, filling your water skin, soaking your clothes, so you can wring them out later. Rain in the desert doesn't last long, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then it's over. The ground doesn't even stay wet for long. Within an hour, the water has evaporated or soaked into the parched earth, and it's as if it never happened. Except you have a full water skin, and that means you might live another few days. But here's the terrible part. Water in the wilderness can kill you. Not just the lack of water, but the water itself. Stagnant water breeds disease. Parasites lay eggs in it. Bacteria multiply in warm, still pools. When you drink contaminated water, you might feel fine at first. But a few hours later, or the next day, the cramps start. Your stomach twists. You're running to find a private spot because diarrhea hits suddenly and violently. And diarrhea in the desert is a death sentence if it's severe, because now you're losing water faster than you can replace it. You're in a horrific cycle. You need water, you drink water, the water makes you sick, the sickness dehydrates you further. You need more water desperately, but drinking more might make it worse. Dysentery, cholera, giardia, these weren't abstract concepts to ancient people. They were real, constant dangers. Many people died not from lack of water, but from bad water. So every time you approach a water source, you're making calculations. How desperate am I? How bad does this water look? Can I afford to wait and look for something better? If I drink this, will I regret it tomorrow? Sometimes you have no choice. You're so desperately thirsty that even if you know the water is probably contaminated, you drink it anyway. Because dying tomorrow from dysentery still means you're alive today, and if you don't drink, you won't make it tomorrow regardless. The prophets faced this constantly. Moses leading Israel through the wilderness, the people crying out for water, on the verge of rebellion, ready to stone Moses because their children were thirsty. And Moses struck the rock at Horeb, and water came out. A miracle. But it was needed because the alternative was watching people die of thirst. Later, at Meribah, the same scenario. No water. People desperate. Moses struck the rock again and got in trouble for it, because God had told him to speak to the rock this time, not strike it. But the desperation was real. The need was immediate. Elijah during the drought, the brook Cherith drying up. The text is so matter-of-fact. After a while, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Can you imagine watching your water source shrink day by day? The stream becoming a trickle, then just disconnected pools, then damp patches, then nothing, knowing that without water you'll die, but God hasn't released you from this place yet. The ravens are still bringing food, but what good is food without water? You can't eat when your mouth is too dry to chew or swallow. And then God sends him to Zarephath, to a widow who has barely any food or water herself. The entire region is in drought. Water is so scarce that this widow is preparing to make one last meal for herself and her son before they die. That's the level of water scarcity we're talking about. Not inconvenience, death. The prophets learned to read the landscape for signs of water. They followed animal tracks because animals know where water is. They watched birds at dawn and dusk because birds fly to water sources. They looked for certain types of vegetation, tamarisk trees, acacia trees, reeds that only grow where there's underground water. They became experts at survival because they had to. They also learned to ration. When you find water, you can't just drink until you're satisfied. You have to think about tomorrow. How far to the next source? Can you carry enough? Your water skin holds maybe a gallon, perhaps 2 if it's large. That's heavy water is 8 pounds per gallon. So you're carrying 16 pounds of water, plus whatever else you have. And you're walking in heat. And you're sweating. And that water in your water skin is the only water you have until you find more. So you take small sips. You swish the water around your mouth to make it last, to trick your body into feeling more satisfied than it is. You wet your lips. You pour a tiny bit on your head to cool down, but mostly you conserve. And you're always thinking, where is the next water? How long until I reach it? Will I have enough? The fear of running out of water becomes a constant companion. It's there when you wake up. It's there all day. It's there when you go to sleep. You have nightmares about your water skin tearing, about water spilling into sand, about being lost without any water at all. And this is why when Jesus talked about living water, when he said, "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst," people understood the metaphor in their bones. They knew thirst. They knew the desperate, all-consuming need for water. They knew what it was like to think about water every waking moment. So the idea of never thirsting again spiritually, yes, but the physical metaphor was powerful. That was an incredible promise. The prophets survived because they learned where to find water and how to make it last. They developed an intimacy with the land, a knowledge earned through desperation. They could look at a dry landscape and see possibilities others missed. They could smell water sometimes or sense the moisture in the air that meant a spring was nearby. But they were never comfortable, never secure. Every day was a new challenge. Find water, purify it if possible, ration it carefully, and pray you'd find more tomorrow. The thirst never fully went away. Even when they drank, they knew that in a few hours they'd be thirsty again. It was endless. And when they finally encountered people again, after weeks or months in the wilderness, and they saw people wasting water, using it carelessly, spilling it, complaining about its taste, something must have broken in them, or hardened, because you can't go back to taking water for granted once you've nearly died from lack of it. You can't watch waste without feeling anger. You can't hear complaints without wanting to shake people and tell them they have no idea how blessed they are. Water changed the prophets, made them grateful for every drop, made them desperate in their prayers, made them utterly dependent on God's provision because human provision wasn't enough in the wilderness. The daily search for water was a daily reminder. You are not self-sufficient. You are fragile. You need help. You need God. That's what thirst taught them. And it's a lesson most of us never learn because our water comes from taps, and we've never had to wonder if we'll die today from dehydration. But prophets knew. Every single day they knew. You're worried about the big dangers. Lions, bears, snakes, the predators you can see coming, the ones that might kill you quickly. But in the wilderness, it's often the smallest things that destroy you, the things you can't see or can't avoid, the invisible enemies that wear you down day by day until you're too weak to continue. Let's start with insects, because the wilderness is full of them, and they're relentless. Flies, not like the flies that occasionally buzz around your home. These are desert flies, and they're everywhere. They're attracted to moisture, which means they're attracted to your eyes, your nose, your mouth, the corners of your eyes where tears form, your nostrils where there's moisture, your lips if they're wet or bleeding, and they land constantly. You wave them away, and within seconds they're back. You can't eat without flies landing on your food. You can't drink without flies drowning in your water. They crawl across your face while you sleep. They get in your ears. They lay eggs in any open wound, and the diseases they carry. Flies land on feces, on rotting carcasses, on infected wounds, and then they land on your face, your food, your water. They spread bacteria, parasites, pathogens. Eye infections were common in the ancient world, partly because of flies. That's why you see references in ancient texts to people with eye problems, to blindness, to oozing eyes. Flies, and there are fleas. You're sleeping on the ground. Rodents have been here before you. They've left fleas, and those fleas are hungry. They jump onto you at night and they bite. Each bite is a small, itchy welt, but you're not getting just one bite. You're getting dozens, hundreds maybe. Your legs, your arms, your torso, all covered in itchy bites. And you scratch. You can't help it. You scratch until you bleed. And those scratches become infected because your hands aren't clean. Nothing is clean, and suddenly you have infected sores all over your body. Lice in your hair, in your beard if you have one, in your clothes. They bite your scalp. They lay eggs, nits, that stick to your hair shafts. You can't get rid of them without cutting your hair very short or shaving it off. And even then, they might survive in your clothes. The itching is constant. The feeling of things crawling on your scalp never stops. Ticks. These are dangerous beyond the immediate discomfort. Ticks burrow into your skin and feed on your blood for days. They swell up like grapes. If you try to pull them out incorrectly, the head stays embedded and causes infection. That's ND ticks carry diseases, serious diseases, fevers, weakness, joint pain. Some tick-borne illnesses can kill you. In the ancient world, they didn't understand disease transmission, so you just get sick and have no idea why. Scorpions. You check your sandals before putting them on because scorpions like to hide in them. You shake out your cloak before wrapping it around yourself. You watch where you put your hands, but you can't be vigilant every second. Eventually, you reach into a crevice or turn over a rock or just have extraordinarily bad luck, and a scorpion stings you. The pain is immediate and intense. Like being stabbed with a hot needle, the venom burns through your flesh. Your hand or foot swells rapidly. The pain radiates up your arm or leg. Some scorpions, like the death stalker, have venom that affects your nervous system. You have trouble breathing. Your heart races irregularly. You sweat profusely. You might convulse. You might die. Actually, children and elderly people often did. Even if you survive, you're sick for days, weak, feverish, unable to function. And there's no antidote, no hospital, no treatment. You just have to endure it and hope your body is strong enough to fight off the venom. Then there are the things inside your body, intestinal parasites. You get them from contaminated water, from unwashed food, from eating with dirty hands, from 100 different ways that are almost impossible to avoid in wilderness conditions. Worms, various kinds. Some are tiny. Some grow to be feet long inside your intestines. They consume nutrients from your food, which means you're eating, but you're not getting the full benefit. You're always hungry, always tired. Your stomach hurts. You're bloated. You have diarrhea or constipation, or both alternating. You pass worms in your stool and see them writhing there, and it's horrifying. Other parasites cause other problems. Giardia makes you violently ill, cramps, diarrhea, dehydration. Amoebas can cause dysentery, bloody stool, fever, weakness that can last for weeks. There's no treatment available to you. You just suffer through it and hope you don't die. And your skin, oh, your skin suffers in the wilderness. The sun in the desert isn't like the sun you're used to. It's brutal, unrelenting. There's no shade unless you find it or create it. And even then, the reflected light from rocks and sand still burns you. Your skin darkens rapidly. But before it darkens, it burns. And we're not talking about a mild sunburn. We're talking about severe sun exposure that causes blistering. Your face, your arms, any exposed skin, it turns red, then darker red, then blisters form. Fluid-filled bubbles that eventually burst, leaving raw, weeping patches. The pain is constant. The skin is tight and hot. When you move, the burned skin cracks and bleeds. And then, because nothing is clean, those cracks get infected. Your lips are especially vulnerable. They dry out, crack deeply, bleed. You lick them to try to moisten them, but that makes it worse. They split open every time you eat or talk. They get infected. They swell. Some prophets probably had permanent scarring on their lips from repeated splitting and infection. And the sand gets everywhere. In your eyes, causing abrasion and irritation. In your mouth, grinding against your teeth, wearing down the enamel. On your skin, especially where you're sweating, and the combination of salt and sand creates a paste that rubs your skin raw. Between your toes and your armpits and your groin, anywhere skin rubs against skin, the sand makes it worse. Raw, bleeding patches that don't heal because you can't keep them clean or dry. Infections are the real killer, because in the wilderness you have no antibiotics, no antiseptics. Maybe you can rinse a wound with water if you have water to spare, which you usually don't. Maybe you can cover it with cloth if you have extra cloth, which you probably don't. So infections just happen. A small cut on your hand becomes red and swollen. Pus forms. The redness spreads up your arm. You develop a fever. The infection gets into your blood. Without treatment, blood infections kill you. It's called sepsis, and it's a horrible way to die of fever, confusion, organ failure, or you get a tooth infection, a cavity, a crack, whatever starts it. But once your tooth is infected, the pain is excruciating. Your face swells. The infection can spread to your jaw, your sinuses, even your brain. People died from tooth infections regularly, or you twist your ankle badly. In civilization, you'd rest it, maybe wrap it, take it easy for a few days. In the wilderness, you can't. You have to keep walking or you won't find water, won't find food, won't survive. So you walk on an injured ankle. It doesn't heal properly. It gets worse. Maybe the joint becomes permanently damaged. Maybe you develop a limp you'll have for the rest of your life. The wilderness breaks bodies down. The prophets who spent years out there didn't come back looking healthy and vibrant. They came back looking weathered, damaged, aged beyond their years. Their skin was leathered and scarred. Their bodies were thin and worn. They moved like older men even if they weren't old. And the thing is, they couldn't do anything about it. There was no medical care, no medicine. When they got sick, they prayed and they endured. When they got injured, they bound it up as best they could and kept going. When parasites infested their bodies, they lived with them. The invisible enemies, the insects, the parasites, the infections, the sun damage, these slowly destroyed the prophets from the outside in and the inside out. Not dramatically. Not in one catastrophic moment. Just gradually, relentlessly, day after day, breaking down their bodies until survival itself was a kind of miracle. And yet they survived. For years, sometimes decades. How? Partly adaptation, their bodies became tougher, more resilient. Partly luck, somehow avoiding the worst infections, the deadliest parasites. Partly divine protection, and the biblical accounts don't shy away from this. When God called someone to be a prophet, God sustained them. Not comfortably, not without suffering, but sustained them nonetheless, because the message mattered more than their comfort. The calling was bigger than their personal well-being, and so they endured things that would break most of us. They accepted pain as part of the cost. They lived with chronic discomfort as their baseline, and they kept going because stopping meant failure, and failure meant the people wouldn't hear what God was saying through them. The enemies you can't see shaped the prophets just as much as the enemies you could. They made prophets hard, tough, impossible to discourage with mere physical discomfort. Because when you've lived with constant itching, constant pain, constant low-level sickness for years, what can anyone threaten you with that's worse? When your body has already been broken down by wilderness living, what leverage does anyone have over you? Nothing. Which is why prophets were so dangerous to the powerful. You couldn't intimidate them. They'd already survived things that would kill most people. They were already living a kind of death in the wilderness. What more could you do to them? At night, when you're huddled in whatever shelter you've found, trying to sleep despite the cold and the rocks digging into your body, you hear them, the predators. The animals that see you not as a person, not as someone made in the image of God, but as meat, as prey, as a potential meal. The wilderness of Judea, the deserts where prophets wandered, the mountains and caves, these places weren't empty. They were full of animals. And some of those animals were very, very dangerous. Let's start with lions. Because, yes, there were lions in the Middle East. Not the African savanna lions you might be picturing, but Asiatic lions, slightly smaller, but just as deadly. They lived in the region until relatively recently in historical terms, the last ones in. The area were killed off in the medieval period. But during biblical times they were common enough that they're mentioned repeatedly in Scripture. The Bible talks about lions more than most modern readers realize. David killed a lion that attacked his father's sheep. Samson killed a lion with his bare hands. Daniel was thrown into a den of lions. The book of Proverbs mentions lions multiple times. They weren't mythological creatures. They were real threats. A lion's roar is one of the most terrifying sounds in nature. It can reach 114 decibels, about as loud as a chainsaw or a rock concert. But it's not just the volume. It's the frequency, the resonance, the way it vibrates through your chest and makes your internal organs feel like they're shaking. It triggers something primal in the human brain. Fear. Immediate, overwhelming fear. When you hear that roar in the darkness, every muscle in your body tenses. Your heart hammers. Your breathing becomes shallow. You're perfectly still, listening, trying to determine how far away it is. A lion's roar can be heard from 5 miles away, so hearing one doesn't necessarily mean it's close, but it might be. You don't know, you can't see. You just know there's an apex predator out there, and you're alone with a wooden staff. Lions hunt at night. They have excellent night vision, much better than yours. They can see you. You can't see them. Not until you catch a reflection of your fire in their eyes, if you have a fire. 2 glowing orbs in the darkness, low to the ground, not moving, just watching. What do you do? If you run, you trigger their chase instinct. A lion can run 50 miles per hour in short bursts. You can't outrun it, not even close. If you climb a tree, if there's a tree nearby, and if you can reach it in time, lions can climb too. Not as well as leopards, but they can do it. Your best bet is fire. Lions are afraid of fire. If you have fire going, if you keep it bright and you wave a torch at them, they'll usually stay back, but that requires having fire, which means you needed to gather wood, needed to have a way to start it, needed to maintain it through the night. And wood is scarce in the desert. So many nights you don't have fire. You just have hope and prayer. And sometimes prayer is enough. Daniel in the lion's den, the story we all know. He was thrown into a den with multiple lions and survived the night. God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. It's a miraculous story, but here's what makes it powerful. Everyone knew what lions did to people. Everyone had seen or heard about people being mauled. The fact that Daniel survived was shocking precisely because lions were known killers. The miracle stood out against a backdrop of reality where lions killed. Then there were bears. Syrian brown bears, specifically. These were smaller than the massive grizzlies of North America, but don't let smaller fool you. They still weighed 400 to 550 pounds. They still had 4-inch claws. They still had jaws powerful enough to crush bones. And they were territorial and aggressive, especially females with cubs. There's a disturbing story in 2 Kings. The prophet Elisha was going up to Bethel, and some young people came out of the city and mocked him. "Go up, you bald head," they jeered. Elisha cursed them in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of them. Modern readers sometimes struggle with that story. It seems harsh. But set aside the theological questions for a moment and just consider the bears. 2 bears mauled 42 people. That tells you something about how dangerous bears were, how fast they moved, how powerful they were, how deadly. If you encounter a bear in the wilderness, your options are limited. You can't outrun it. Bears can run 25 to 30 miles per hour. You probably can't outclimb it. Bears are excellent climbers. You can try to make yourself look big, make noise, back away slowly. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. And if a bear decides to attack, you're in serious trouble. Those claws can disembowel you with one swipe. Those jaws can crush your skull. People who survived bear attacks, and many didn't, were left with horrific injuries. Faces destroyed, limbs mangled, deep lacerations that got infected. Wolves and jackals hunted in packs. A single wolf might not attack a healthy human, but a pack would. They'd circle you, test your defenses, look for weakness. If you were injured, sick, or exhausted, they'd sense it, and then they'd move in. Jackals are smaller, but they're bold. They'd come right into camps looking for food. And if you were sleeping, if you were alone, if you couldn't defend yourself effectively, they might decide you were food. Then there were hyenas. Striped hyenas lived in the region. They're primarily scavengers, but they're also opportunistic hunters. They have incredibly powerful jaws, strong enough to crack open large bones to get at the marrow inside. Those same jaws could easily crush a human arm or leg. Hyenas are also unsettling because of the sounds they make. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, something in between that sounds almost human, but wrong. Hearing that in the darkness, not knowing how close they are or how many there are, is psychologically disturbing. And leopards. Beautiful, sleek, deadly. Leopards are ambush predators. They're incredibly stealthy. They can be 10 feet away from you, and you wouldn't know it until they pounced. They're also strong. They can drag prey heavier than themselves up into trees. A leopard attack is sudden and overwhelming. They go for the throat, trying to suffocate their prey or sever major blood vessels. If you survive the initial attack, you're still dealing with deep puncture wounds from their teeth and slashing wounds from their claws. Infections almost guaranteed. But in some ways, the smaller predators were even more dangerous because you encountered them more frequently. Snakes, for example. The region had several species of venomous snakes. The Palestine viper was particularly common and particularly dangerous. It had hemotoxic venom, which means it destroys tissue and blood cells. A bite causes immediate severe pain, massive swelling, blistering, and tissue death around the bite site. Without treatment, it can be fatal. The saw-scaled viper was smaller but aggressive. It had a habit of lying partially buried in sand, nearly invisible, and it would strike if you stepped near it. Its venom caused internal bleeding. People bled from their gums, their nose, even their eyes. They vomited blood. Many died. The problem with snakes is that you often don't see them until it's too late. You're walking, focused on the path ahead, and you step too close to a snake basking on a rock. Or you sit down to rest and put your hand down right next to where a snake is coiled. Or you reach into a crevice looking for water, and there's a snake inside. And once you're bitten, there's no antivenom, no hospital. You can try traditional remedies, cutting the wound to make it bleed more, trying to suck out venom, applying various herbs. But mostly, you just have to hope you got a dry bite where the snake didn't inject much venom, or that your body is strong enough to fight it off. Scorpions we already talked about, but it's worth mentioning again because they were so common. Every night you had to be careful. Check everything, shake everything out. And even then, you might miss one. The death stalker scorpion's venom could kill a child or a weakened adult. Even if it didn't kill you, the pain was excruciating for hours or days. So every single night in the wilderness was a gamble. You found the best shelter you could. You tried to protect yourself with fire if possible, with your position if not. Maybe you wedged yourself into a narrow cave where larger predators couldn't reach. Maybe you climbed up onto a rock ledge. Maybe you just sat with your back against stone and your staff in hand and stayed awake as long as you could, and you prayed. You prayed for protection. You prayed that God would keep the predators away. You prayed that you'd see morning. The biblical accounts include miraculous protections. Daniel and the lions, Paul bitten by a viper and suffering no harm, David protected while tending sheep, prophets delivered from danger again and again. But here's what's important to understand. The miracles stand out because the danger was real. God protecting prophets from lions was remarkable precisely because lions killed people regularly. The protection was supernatural because the threat was natural and deadly. And not everyone was protected all the time. Prophets were attacked. They were injured. They bore scars from encounters with animals. The wilderness was genuinely dangerous, and they lived in it for years. How did they survive? Several ways. They learned the behavior of animals. They knew that most predators prefer easier prey. If you appeared strong, healthy, alert, most animals would avoid you. But if you were weak, sick, or asleep, you became vulnerable. They used fire when possible. Fire keeps most animals at bay, but maintaining fire requires fuel, and fuel is scarce in the desert. So fire was a luxury, not a guarantee. They chose their shelter carefully. High places where predators were less likely to venture. Narrow spaces where large animals couldn't fit. Caves with small entrances that could be partially blocked. They stayed alert. Even in sleep, part of their brain was always listening, always monitoring, always ready to wake at the snap of a twig or the rustle of movement. And they trusted God, because ultimately that's all they had. No weapons capable of taking down a bear or lion. No backup. No rescue coming. Just faith that the God who called them into the wilderness would sustain them in the wilderness. Psalm 91 probably meant something different to them than it does to us. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. That wasn't poetic metaphor. That was daily life. The terror of night was real. It had teeth and claws. The pestilence that stalks in darkness was a lion or a bear or a pack of wolves. And the promise that God would guard them was the only thing standing between them and death. The predators that hunted in the wilderness shaped the prophets into men who feared God more than they feared anything else. Because once you've faced down a lion and survived, once you've heard a bear outside your shelter and lived through the night, once you've been bitten by a snake and recovered against all odds, human threats seem less impressive. Kings couldn't intimidate prophets who'd survived years in the wilderness. What was a king compared to a lion? What was a throne room compared to a cave with predators outside? What was political power compared to the power of God who'd kept them alive when nature itself tried to kill them? The wilderness predators were part of the curriculum. They taught prophets that they were vulnerable, dependent, mortal, and they taught prophets that God's protection was real, tangible, and the only thing that mattered. Human beings are not designed for isolation. We're social creatures. Our brains literally need social interaction to function properly. Studies on solitary confinement show that prolonged isolation causes psychological damage, hallucinations, paranoia, depression, cognitive decline. And that's with people who know their isolation is temporary, who still have guards they interact with, who are being fed regularly. Now imagine isolation in the wilderness. No scheduled end date, no guards bringing food, no walls to protect you. Just you and the vast, empty landscape. Days stretching into weeks, stretching into months, stretching into years. No human voice but your own. No human face but the one you see reflected in still water. No human touch. No companionship. No conversation. Nothing. This is what broke even the strongest prophets. Not the hunger, though that was terrible. Not the thirst, though that was desperate. Not the predators, though they were terrifying. The loneliness, the isolation, the weight of being utterly, completely alone. Let's walk through what this actually feels like, day by day. The first few days you might actually enjoy the solitude. It's peaceful, quiet, no demands on you. You can think clearly, pray without interruption. It's almost like a spiritual retreat. By the end of the first week, the novelty is wearing off. You're starting to miss people. You think about conversations you had, wishing you could talk to someone now. You hear your own voice speaking aloud, narrating what you're doing, talking to yourself, singing maybe. It feels a little strange, but it helps. By the end of the second week, you're craving human interaction intensely. You'd give anything to see another person, to hear another voice, to have a simple conversation about anything at all. You start talking to yourself more regularly. Not just narrating, having full conversations. Asking yourself questions, answering them, arguing different viewpoints. A month in, you're talking to God constantly. Not formal prayers, just ongoing dialogue. Talking about what you see, what you're feeling, what you're afraid of, what you're hoping for. God becomes your conversation partner by necessity. And sometimes God answers through scripture that comes to mind, through a sense of presence, through circumstances that seem to speak. But sometimes there's just silence, and the silence is heavy. 2 months in, you're having conversations with imaginary people. You know they're not real, but you do it anyway because you need to hear dialogue, even if it's all in your head. You remember people from your past and imagine what they'd say in response to what you're experiencing. You picture their faces, hear their voices in your memory. 3 months in, the isolation is doing strange things to your mind. Time stops making sense. You lose track of days. Was that 3 days ago or 5? How long have you been out here? You're not entirely sure anymore. Your thoughts become circular. You think the same things over and over because there's no new input, no new stimulus. You forget how to have normal conversations. The social skills you once had start to atrophy. The give and take of dialogue, reading social cues, moderating your tone, these skills require practice, and you're not practicing. When you do eventually encounter people, you come across as strange, intense, socially awkward. Because you are. You've forgotten how to be normal. The depression comes in waves. Some days you wake up and can barely move. The emptiness inside you feels heavier than your body. There's no point in getting up. No point in looking for food. No point in continuing. You lie there on the hard ground and stare at nothing, and feel nothing except a crushing, suffocating despair. This happened to Elijah. After his great victory on Mount Carmel, calling down fire from heaven, defeating the prophets of Baal, proving God's power, he ran into the wilderness, fleeing Jezebel's death threat. And in the wilderness, alone, the depression hit him like a physical blow. He sat under a broom tree and prayed to die. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life." This is Elijah, the great prophet, the mighty man of God. And he was so depressed that death seemed preferable to continuing. God's response is tender and telling. An angel came and touched him, brought him food and water, let him sleep, came back and fed him again. God didn't immediately give him a pep talk or tell him to snap out of it. God met his physical needs first, fed him, let him rest, gave him strength. And even then Elijah walked 40 days to Horeb, probably processing his trauma with every step, before he was ready to hear from God again. This is what isolation does. It breaks you down. It strips away all the layers of social conditioning and personality that you've built up and reveals the raw, vulnerable core of who you are. And sometimes what you find there is darkness, fear, doubt, weakness. Jeremiah felt it too. He's sometimes called the weeping prophet, and his book is full of laments. "Cursed be the day I was born," he wrote. "Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame?" This is a prophet of God, called by God, sustained by God, and he's wishing he'd never been born. The loneliness drove him to that place. The isolation of being the only one speaking God's truth. The rejection of everyone he tried to reach. The realization that he was utterly alone in his calling. Moses, leading Israel through the wilderness, cried out to God, "I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me." Even Moses, who spoke with God face to face, who saw miracles, who led a nation, even he reached a breaking point where the loneliness of leadership, the weight of responsibility, the isolation of being the one person standing between God and the people, it all became too much. The wilderness isolation magnified everything. Good days felt impossibly good moments of God's presence, of clarity, of purpose. Bad days felt unbearably bad, crushing depression, paralyzing fear, absolute despair. There was no middle ground, no moderation. No one to talk you off the ledge when your thoughts spiraled. No one to encourage you when you felt like giving up. Just you and your mind and whatever demons, literal or figurative, were circling. And the worst part? When you finally did encounter people again, you didn't fit anymore. You'd been changed by the wilderness in ways that made you alien to normal society. You looked different, wild, unkempt, intimidating. Children were afraid of you. Adults crossed the street to avoid you. You acted different. You'd lost social graces. You spoke too intensely. You didn't understand small talk anymore. How could you discuss trivial things when you'd been facing death daily? How could you care about gossip or weather or any of the mundane concerns of settled life when you'd been wrestling with God in the desert? You had a message people didn't want to hear. Repentance, judgment, warning, hard truths that made them uncomfortable. So they rejected you, mocked you, threatened you, drove you away. And then you were back in the wilderness, more alone than before, because now you knew that even among people you were isolated. There was no place for you in society. The wilderness was your home because you couldn't be anywhere else. John the Baptist embodied this completely. He grew up in the wilderness. The text tells us, the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. He came out of the wilderness to preach, and people came to him, drawn by his intensity, his authenticity, his uncompromising message. But he never really left the wilderness. It was in his bones. His clothing, his food, his manner, all of it screamed wilderness prophet. And when he confronted Herod about his unlawful marriage, speaking truth to power in that characteristically prophet way, it cost him prison, death, but even imprisonment couldn't break what the wilderness had forged. John sent disciples to ask Jesus if he was truly the Messiah, but he never recanted his message, never apologized, never tried to save himself by compromising. The loneliness of wilderness living created a particular kind of person, someone who couldn't be bought because they had no need for possessions, someone who couldn't be intimidated because they'd already faced worse, someone who couldn't be manipulated through social pressure because they'd been isolated from society so long that its approval meant nothing. But that strength came at a cost. The cost was connection, belonging, ease in human relationships, the ability to just be normal. Prophets paid that cost. They accepted the loneliness as part of the calling. They knew that hearing God's voice clearly often required being away from all other voices. They knew that depending on God completely often required being cut off from human support. But it hurt. God never said it wouldn't hurt. The biblical accounts are honest about this. Prophets wept. Prophets complained. Prophets begged God to release them from their calling. And God heard them. God was tender with them. But God also sustained them because the message mattered more than their comfort. In the isolation, prophets learned things they couldn't have learned any other way. They learned that God was enough. That when everything else was stripped away, community, comfort, security, even sometimes the sense of God's presence, faith itself, could sustain them. They learned the difference between believing in God and knowing God, between knowing about God and being intimate with God. The loneliness forced intimacy with the divine. When you have no one else to talk to, you talk to God. When you have no one else to depend on, you depend on God. When you have no other comfort, you find comfort in God. And slowly, over months and years, that relationship becomes more real than any human relationship you've ever had. But it's also painful, because God doesn't give you everything humans give you. God doesn't laugh at your jokes in a way you can hear, doesn't give you a hug when you're sad, doesn't sit across from you at a meal and share the simple joy of companionship. The spiritual is real and profound, but it doesn't meet all the needs of being human. And God knows that, which is why in the creation story, God looked at Adam, alone in a perfect paradise with God's presence, and said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." So the prophets in the wilderness lived in a tension, called to isolation for a purpose, but suffering in that isolation, experiencing profound spiritual intimacy with God, but lacking human connection, strong in ways that civilization could never forge, but broken in ways that only isolation breaks you. Some prophets had moments of reprieve. Elijah had Elisha eventually, a disciple, a companion, someone who shared the calling and the burden. John the Baptist had disciples who came to him in the wilderness. Moses had moments of community with the Israelites, though more often they were a source of stress than comfort. But mostly, prophets were alone, and that aloneness shaped their message. When Jeremiah spoke about God knowing him before he was formed in the womb, about God being close even when all others had abandoned him, he wasn't speaking theoretically. He was speaking from experience. The isolation had taught him that God's presence was the only constant, the only thing that couldn't be taken away. When Elijah heard the still, small voice of God, not in the earthquake or the wind or the fire, but in the gentle whisper, he was learning that God met him in his depression, in his fear, in his isolation. That God's presence wasn't always dramatic and overwhelming. Sometimes it was quiet and intimate and tender. When John the Baptist declared, "He must increase, I must decrease," he understood what that meant, because the wilderness had already decreased him, had stripped away ego, ambition, self-importance, had left only the essential, the message, the calling, the pointing toward someone greater. The loneliness that crushes is also the loneliness that refines. It burns away everything that doesn't matter. It forces you to confront yourself without distraction. It drives you to God because there's nowhere else to go. And in that process, as painful as it is, prophets became who they were meant to be. But don't romanticize it. Don't think of it as some beautiful spiritual journey. It was brutal. It broke them repeatedly. Some prophets probably didn't survive, not physically died necessarily, but gave up, walked away, couldn't sustain the calling. We only know about the ones who made it through, and even they barely made it sometimes. When you're lying awake at night in the wilderness, cold and hungry and completely alone, listening to the wind and wondering if you're going insane, wondering if God really spoke to you or if you imagined it all, wondering if anyone will ever hear your message or if you'll just die out here forgotten, in those moments there's no glory, no sense of purpose, just grinding, aching loneliness that makes you want to weep except you're too dehydrated to produce tears. That's the reality, and prophets lived in that reality for years. They endured loneliness that would hospitalize modern people with psychological trauma. They survived isolation that studies have shown causes permanent damage to the brain. They survived because they had to, because God sustained them, because the calling was real even when everything else felt unreal, because somewhere, somehow, they found the strength to get up one more morning, walk one more day, face one more night alone. And when they finally came out of the wilderness, or when they went back and forth between wilderness and civilization, they carried that loneliness with them. It never fully left. You could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. They'd been to a place most people never go, seen things most people never see, experienced an isolation most people can't imagine. And it made them dangerous. Not physically dangerous, spiritually dangerous. Because people who have nothing to lose, who've been stripped of everything that usually controls human behavior, social approval, comfort, security, those people can speak truth without fear. They can stand before kings and speak. They can confront nations and not flinch. They can deliver God's message knowing they'll be rejected, knowing they'll be alone again, and they do it anyway. The loneliness that crushes is also the loneliness that liberates. It frees you from the chains of needing approval, needing acceptance, needing to belong. And in that terrible freedom, prophets found the courage to speak what God told them to speak, regardless of the cost. But it cost them everything. Every prophet paid with their comfort, their relationships, their place in society, Many paid with their lives, and all of them paid with their sanity, at least temporarily, as the isolation ground them down to nothing, and then somehow built them back up into something new. That's what wilderness loneliness did to prophets. It killed who they were and resurrected them as who they needed to be, and the process was agony from start to finish. The wilderness wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a spiritual battlefield. When you're alone, hungry, exhausted, scared, when your defenses are at their lowest, that's when the spiritual attacks are most intense. Jesus experienced this. After his baptism, the Spirit led him into the wilderness, not to a comfortable retreat center, into the desert. And there he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. The text tells us that he was hungry, which is an understatement. After 40 days without food, Jesus was on the edge of death from starvation. His body would have been consuming its own muscle tissue. His brain would have been affected, thoughts unclear, reality unstable. And that's when Satan came to tempt him. Think about the timing. Not when Jesus was strong and well-fed and surrounded by disciples. When he was at his absolute weakest, most vulnerable moment. When a normal human would have been hallucinating, barely conscious, desperate for anything to ease the suffering. The first temptation. If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Food. The thing Jesus needed most desperately. The thing his body was screaming for. Not a temptation to do something obviously evil. Just ... eat. Use your power to meet your legitimate need. What's wrong with that? Everything, as it turns out. Because the temptation wasn't just about bread. It was about trusting God's provision versus taking matters into his own hands. About submitting to the Father's plan versus asserting his own will. About living by faith versus living by sight. Jesus answered with Scripture. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Even starving, even dying, the spiritual was more than the physical. The Word of God was more essential than food. The second temptation took Jesus to the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. Notice that Satan quotes Scripture. He knows the Bible. He can twist it to serve his purposes. The temptation here was to test God, to force God to act, to make a spectacular display that would prove Jesus' identity beyond doubt. Jesus responded with Scripture again. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Trust doesn't need proof. Faith doesn't demand signs. Following God means obeying even when you're not sure, even when God's plan doesn't make sense. The third temptation. Satan showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. The shortcut, the easy path. You want to reign? Here it is. No cross, no suffering, no sacrifice. Just compromise this one thing, your allegiance, and everything else is yours, Jesus. Away from me, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God, and serve him only. And then Satan left him, and angels came and attended him. This is the pattern of spiritual warfare in the wilderness. Attack when the person is weakest. Use legitimate needs as entry points. Twist Scripture. Offer shortcuts that avoid the hard path God has laid out. Question God's goodness, God's provision, God's plan. Every prophet faced this. Not always as dramatically as Jesus did, not always with Satan appearing personally, but the spiritual battle was constant. The temptation to give up, to walk away, to decide you heard wrong, that God didn't really call you, that this suffering isn't worth it. That voice in your head saying, just go home. You've tried. You've sacrificed enough. God wouldn't ask this of you. You must have misunderstood the temptation to compromise the message, make it more palatable, soften the hard parts, tell people what they want to hear instead of what God told you to say. Just a little adjustment, just enough to avoid persecution, just enough to be accepted. What's the harm? The temptation to despair, to believe that your life is meaningless, that your suffering has no purpose, that God has abandoned you, that you'll die out here forgotten, and it won't matter. The crushing weight of hopelessness pressing down until you can't breathe. The temptation to pride. When you do survive another day, when you do hear from God, when you do see success in your ministry, the thought that you're special, chosen, better than others, that you've earned God's favor through your suffering, that you deserve recognition, appreciation, reward. The Bible speaks matter-of-factly about demons in the wilderness. It wasn't just a metaphor for ancient people. They believed, and the text affirms, that there were actual spiritual beings, hostile to God and to God's people, active in the world, and especially active in isolated places. When you're alone in the wilderness at night, when your mind is affected by hunger and exhaustion, when the darkness presses in and the sounds are strange and your thoughts spiral, how do you distinguish between your own fear and actual demonic oppression? Between natural loneliness and spiritual attack? Between physical weakness causing mental confusion and something actively trying to destroy you? You can't always. Which makes it more terrifying? You're fighting battles on multiple fronts, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and they all blend together until you're not sure what you're fighting anymore. You just know you're fighting. Prophets described feeling spiritual oppression, a heaviness that descended that had no natural explanation, a sense of evil presence, thoughts that didn't feel like their own, overwhelming fear beyond what the circumstances warranted, suicidal ideation that came suddenly and intensely, and they fought. They prayed, they quoted Scripture, they called on God's name. They worshipped even when they didn't feel like it. They held onto faith like a drowning person holds onto a rope, even when they couldn't see where the rope led or who was holding the other end. Sometimes they had supernatural experiences that sustained them, angels appearing with food and water, like happened with Elijah, visions of God's glory that renewed their strength, audible voices speaking encouragement, physical sensations of God's presence, warmth, peace, a sense of being held. But sometimes there was just silence, just the battle, just the grinding endurance of holding on when everything in you wants to let go. The wilderness amplified spiritual warfare because isolation removes normal support systems. In community, when you're struggling spiritually, others can pray for you, encourage you, remind you of truth. In the wilderness, you're on your own. You have to be your own prayer warrior, your own encourager, your own reminder of truth. You have to preach to yourself because no one else is preaching to you. You have to remember Scripture because no one else is there to speak it over you. You have to worship even when it feels pointless, because worship is warfare, and you need the weapons. The prophets became skilled spiritual warriors because they had to. Every day was a battle. Every night was a struggle. The enemy didn't take breaks, didn't give them days off. was relentless in trying to make them give up, compromise, despair, or fall into pride. And sometimes the prophets lost battles. They had moments of doubt, moments of compromise, moments of despair. The Bible is honest about this. Prophets weren't superhuman. They were human beings under extraordinary pressure, and sometimes they cracked. But they kept going, kept fighting, kept choosing to trust God even when trust felt impossible, kept speaking God's word even when it cost them everything, kept walking the path they were called to walk even when every step was through fire. The spiritual warfare in the wilderness forged prophets into warriors. Not warriors with swords and shields, but warriors with faith and endurance. Warriors who knew how to stand when everything in them wanted to run. Who knew how to speak truth when lies would be easier. Who knew how to keep trusting when trust seemed foolish. That's what the spiritual battle did. It tested them until everything false burned away and only the real remained. It pushed them beyond what they thought they could endure and then pushed further. It broke them and rebuilt them stronger. But God helped them. It was hard. Harder than the hunger, harder than the thirst, harder than the predators. Because physical threats end one way or another. Spiritual battles just keep going, day after day, night after night, year after year. And the prophets who survived learned something that most people never learn, that the spiritual realm is more real than the physical, that the battles fought in prayer matter more than battles fought with weapons, that standing firm spiritually when everything else is falling apart is the greatest victory possible. They learned it by living it, by fighting it, by barely surviving it, and by discovering at the end of themselves that God was there, had been there all along, was fighting for them even when they couldn't fight for themselves. The wilderness was where prophets learned to be warriors, and the enemy hated them for it, because people who've been through that kind of spiritual battle and emerged still standing, those people are dangerous to darkness. They can't be intimidated, can't be deceived easily, can't be bought or bribed or broken. They've already been through the worst the enemy could throw at them and survived. What more could possibly frighten them? When prophets emerged from the wilderness, people knew exactly what they were. You couldn't mistake a wilderness prophet for a normal person. Everything about them screamed that they'd been somewhere most people never went, that they'd seen things most people never saw, that they'd been changed in ways that couldn't be hidden. Let's start with their clothing. The Bible describes John the Baptist's clothing specifically. John wore clothing made of camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist. Camel hair, not soft, comfortable wool, not fine linen. Camel hair, the rough outer coat of a camel, coarse and bristly. Why camel hair? Several reasons. First, it was available in the wilderness. Camels shed their coats seasonally, and you could collect the hair. Second, it was incredibly durable. Camel hair could withstand harsh conditions, resist wear, last for years. Third, it was the opposite of luxury. Wearing camel hair was a statement. I am not here for comfort. But imagine actually wearing it. Camel hair garments were scratchy, irritating against bare skin. The fabric was rough enough to cause chafing. If you sweated, which you did constantly in the desert heat, the salt made it worse abrasive fabric. Plus, salty sweat equals raw, irritated skin. But that was the point. Prophets weren't seeking comfort. They were making a visible statement about simplicity, about rejection of worldly values, about focus on the essential. The leather belt around the waist wasn't decorative. It was functional. You tucked your robe into it when you needed to move quickly or work. You hung things from it, a water skin, a small pouch for food, maybe a knife if you had one. It was like wearing a utility belt, holding together the few possessions you had. And that was it. One garment. Maybe two if you were fortunate one to wear while the other dried after washing. No wardrobe. No options. The same rough garment every single day, getting more worn, more stained, more embedded with desert dust and sweat and smoke. Footwear was minimal or non-existent. Some prophets went barefoot. Others had simple leather sandals, basically just a sole attached with straps. Nothing like modern shoes with cushioning and support. Your feet were exposed to heat, to sharp rocks, to thorns, to everything. After months or years in the wilderness, prophets' feet became like leather themselves. Thick calluses built up on the soles. The skin hardened, darkened, cracked. Toenails became thick and yellowed. Feet were scarred, permanently damaged from thousands of miles of walking on brutal terrain. Now their hair. Prophets didn't have scissors or razors. They didn't have mirrors. They didn't have combs. Their hair grew long, tangled, matted with dust and sweat. Their beards grew wild. Imagine months without cutting your hair, without washing it properly, without any grooming at all. The desert wind and sun did a number on hair. It became dry, brittle, stiff with accumulated dust. It formed dreadlocks naturally not styled, just matted and tangled into clumps. Twigs and thorns got caught in it. Insects might nest in it. Some prophets probably cut their hair occasionally with a sharp stone or knife, just to keep it manageable. But it would never look groomed, never look intentional. It looked wild because they were wild. Their skin told its own story. Years of desert sun created a deep, dark tan, almost like leather. But it wasn't the even tan of someone who sunbathes carefully. It was weathered, damaged skin. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting in bright sun. Cracks in the skin from dry air and wind. Permanent damage on the nose, cheeks, forehead from sun exposure. Scars everywhere. On hands from working with rough materials, from climbing rocks, from countless small cuts and injuries. On feet from sharp stones and thorns. On arms and legs from brushes with thorny bushes, from animal encounters, from just living rough. Each scar told a story of survival. Their faces were gaunt. Months or years of inadequate nutrition left them thin, with prominent cheekbones, sunken eyes, sharp jawlines. But this wasn't the fashionable thin of intentional diet. This was a malnourished thin of people barely getting enough to survive. You could see the skull beneath the skin. Their eyes, though their eyes were intense. People who've spent years in solitude, years in contemplation and prayer, years seeing things most people never see, their gaze is different. Piercing, uncomfortable, like they're looking through you instead of at you, like they see more than they should. And the smell, let's be honest. Prophets didn't have soap, didn't have deodorant, didn't have laundry detergent. They washed when they had water to spare, which wasn't often. They wore the same garment day after day. They sweated constantly. They smelled like smoke when they'd had fire. Like animals, camels, goats from wearing animal hair. Like sweat and dust and unwashed human. It wasn't pleasant. It was noticeable. When a prophet entered a room, you knew it. Their bodies moved differently, too. Years of sleeping on stone, of constant walking, of physical hardship, it affected their gait, their posture. Many probably had chronic pain, bad backs from the sleeping conditions, damaged knees from walking, arthritis from exposure to cold and damp. They moved like men older than their years, stiff and careful. Their hands were powerful but damaged, calloused, scarred with broken nails and gnarled fingers. These were hands that had worked, that had gripped staffs for thousands of miles, that had climbed rocks and gathered food and built fires and fought off animals. Their teeth were in bad shape, no dental care, diets lacking in nutrients, constant grinding sand in their food. Teeth would be worn down, discolored, missing. Gum disease would be common, bad breath chronic. So when a prophet appeared in town, everything about him was jarring. He looked wrong, smelled wrong, moved wrong, moved wrong. His appearance itself was a rebuke to comfortable civilization. He was a walking reminder that life could be reduced to its barest essentials, that everything they took for granted was luxury, that their comfortable existence was not the only way to live. And people responded predictably. Children were frightened. They saw this wild-looking man with crazy hair and fierce eyes, and they hid behind their mothers. Adults were unsettled. Some were curious. Others were hostile. Many were dismissive. He's crazy. Look at him. What could someone like that possibly have to say that matters? But they couldn't ignore prophets either, because as strange as they looked, there was also something compelling, an authenticity, a power, a sense that this person had been somewhere, done something, knew something that they didn't. The appearance reinforced the message. When a prophet spoke about judgment, about the futility of material wealth, about God's call to radical obedience, his very body was evidence. He'd given up everything. He'd survived by faith. He'd been refined by hardship. He wasn't speaking theoretically. He was speaking from lived experience. Elijah is described as a hairy man with a leather belt, basically the same description as John the Baptist. This was recognizable, a type. Oh, one of those, a wilderness prophet. People knew what that meant. Ezekiel was told to perform strange prophetic acts, lying on his side for extended periods, cooking food over dung, shaving his head and beard with a sword. These weren't random. They were visual messages, using his body to communicate what God wanted to say. Isaiah walked around naked and barefoot for 3 years as a prophetic sign. Imagine that. A prophet, already looking strange, now completely naked in public for 3 years. The point was to shock, to make people pay attention, to embody the message of coming shame and captivity. The prophet's appearance was part of their prophetic calling. They were living symbols, walking billboards. Their bodies proclaimed their message before they ever opened their mouths, and they couldn't go back. Even if a prophet wanted to return to normal life, he couldn't. Years in the wilderness had permanently marked him. His body was changed. His appearance was changed. His entire way of being in the world was changed. He couldn't fit into polite society anymore, couldn't make small talk, couldn't care about social conventions, couldn't pretend that appearance and status and comfort mattered, because he'd lived without all of it and survived. He'd found that the essential thing, relationship with God, obedience to calling, was enough. Everything else was extra. So prophets looked the way they did, not by accident, but by necessity. The wilderness shaped their bodies, as much as it shaped their souls. It stripped away everything soft, everything comfortable, everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. What remained was hard, lean, weathered, and impossible to ignore. When people saw a prophet, they saw someone who'd been to the edge and come back, someone who'd faced death and survived, someone who'd been alone with God in a way most people never would be, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated or persuaded to compromise. They saw someone dangerous. Not physically, prophets weren't usually violent, but spiritually dangerous. Dangerous to complacency, dangerous to injustice, dangerous to the comfortable lies people told themselves. And all of that was written on their bodies and their appearance and the way they looked and smelled and moved through the world. Prophets were living testimonies to a different way of being human, a harder way, a more authentic way, a way that most people respected in theory but would never choose for themselves. That's why prophets looked the way they did. Their appearance was their credentials. Their bodies were their resumes. One look told you everything you needed to know. This person had been through something most people never face, and they'd survived, and they had something to say that you probably needed to hear, even if you didn't want to. Let's sit with Elijah for a while, because his story is one of the most human, most relatable accounts in all of Scripture. And it all happens in the aftermath of his greatest victory, Mount Carmel. You probably know the story. Israel had been worshiping Baal, abandoning God. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest. They'd each prepare a sacrifice and call on their God to send fire. Whichever God answered, that was the real God. The prophets of Baal went first. 450 of them. They prepared their bull, laid it on the altar, and started calling on Baal. Morning came and went. Nothing. They called louder. Nothing. Elijah started mocking them. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's in the bathroom. The prophets of Baal got desperate, shouting, dancing, cutting themselves with swords until blood poured out. Nothing. All day. No response. Then Elijah's turn. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, arranged the wood, cut up the bull. Then, and this is remarkable, he ordered them to drench everything in water. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it over the offering. Do it again. Do it a 3rd time. Water flooded the altar, filled the trench around it. Everything was soaked. Then Elijah prayed, not shouting, not cutting himself, just a simple prayer. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you are God. And fire fell from heaven, not a little flame, consuming fire that burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and licked up the water in the trench. Undeniable. Overwhelming. The people fell on their faces. The Lord, He is God. Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal seized, all 450 of them. They were executed in the Kishon Valley. Then Elijah prayed for rain to end the 3-year drought. He told King Ahab to go eat and drink because heavy rain was coming. Then he climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees, praying. 7 times he sent his servant to look toward the sea. Nothing, 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 nothing. Finally, the 7th time, a cloud as small as a man's hand. Then the sky grew dark with clouds, wind rose, and heavy rain came. Elijah tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel, about 17 miles. Running in the rain. After everything else that day, This was Elijah's finest hour. Fire from heaven, rain ending the drought, the people returning to God, complete victory, vindication of everything he'd been saying for years. And then he got a message. Queen Jezebel heard what happened. Her prophets were dead, and she sent word to Elijah, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them," a death threat. And Elijah, who just called down fire from heaven, who defeated 450 prophets, who'd outrun a chariot Elijah ran, he ran for his life. He left his servant in Beersheba and went a day's journey into the wilderness, alone, exhausted, and he sat down under a solitary broom tree. Broom trees in the desert are scraggly, stunted. They provide minimal shade. It's not lush comfort. It's barely protection from the sun, and that's where Elijah collapsed. And he prayed, but not a prayer of faith, not a prayer of power. He prayed, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He wanted to die. Right there, under that tree, after his greatest victory, Elijah wanted God to kill him. The emotional crash was complete. The adrenaline was gone. The victory felt hollow. Jezebel was still alive, still threatening him. Nothing had really changed, and he was done, finished, had nothing left. He lay down under the tree and fell asleep. Sleep of utter exhaustion, both physical and emotional. He slept because he had nothing else to do, nowhere else to go, no energy left to keep running. And then an angel touched him. "Get up and eat." He looked around. There, by his head, was bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Fresh bread, clean water. Miraculous provision. He ate, drank, and lay down again, still too exhausted, too depressed to do anything else. The angel came back, touched him again. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." Notice what the angel didn't say. Didn't say, "Snap out of it." Didn't say, "Have more faith." Didn't say, "Remember the fire you just saw from heaven." Just, "Get up, eat. The journey is too much for you." God met Elijah's physical needs first, fed him, let him rest, acknowledged that, yes, this is too much. You're overwhelmed. That's okay. Eat. Rest. Get your strength back. Elijah ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That's Mount Sinai, the same mountain where Moses met God, where God gave the law, where God's presence dwelt. Elijah walked there, over 200 miles through wilderness, processing everything, working through his trauma, his fear, his disappointment, his depression. When he arrived, he found a cave and spent the night there, hiding, in the dark, in a hole in the rock, as far as you can get from standing boldly on Mount Carmel, calling down fire. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's a gentle question, not accusatory. Just, what are you doing here? How did you get from Mount Carmel to hiding in a cave? Elijah's answer is telling. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Hear the pain in that. I've been zealous. I've done everything right, and they rejected it. Rejected you. Killed your prophets. I'm alone, and they want to kill me too. It's not fair. I've sacrificed everything, and it didn't matter. God's response wasn't argument, wasn't actually, "You're not alone. There are 7,000 others." God first gave Elijah an experience. "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. Elijah had experienced God in power on Mount Carmel. Fire from heaven, dramatic, undeniable. But here, God came in gentleness, in quiet, in the kind of presence you can only hear when you stop striving, stop performing, stop trying to prove anything. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Same question, giving him another chance to process, to speak his pain. Elijah gave the same answer, word for word. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." And this time God responded with truth and with a plan. First, the truth. "I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal." You're not alone. You never were. You felt alone, but you weren't. Then the plan, go back. Anoint Hazael king over Aram. Anoint Jehu king over Israel. Anoint Elisha as your successor. You have work to do. The story isn't over. And you're not going to do it alone anymore. Elisha is coming to help you. God didn't shame Elijah for his depression, didn't rebuke him for running, didn't tell him to have more faith. God fed him, let him rest, let him process, let him speak his pain twice, showed him a different side of divine presence, gave him truth, gave him community, gave him a path forward. And Elijah got up and went, not instantly healed of depression, that's not how it works, but with enough to take the next step. Find Elisha, start moving again. Trust that God wasn't done with him yet. This story matters because it shows that even the strongest prophets broke. Even someone who'd seen fire fall from heaven could fall into suicidal depression. Faith doesn't make you immune to mental health struggles. Seeing miracles doesn't prevent emotional crashes. And it shows how God responds, with tenderness, with provision, with patience, with presence. Not demanding immediate recovery, but meeting people where they are and giving them what they need to eventually move forward. Aisha in his depression cave is one of the most honest, vulnerable moments in all of Scripture, and it's there to tell us it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be overwhelmed. It's okay to reach a breaking point. God knows. God understands. And God will meet you there, in the cave, in the darkness, in the moment when you can't go on, and God will give you enough for one more step, and then another, and then another, until somehow, impossibly, you're moving again. John the Baptist was born for the wilderness. Even before his birth, the angel told his father, Zechariah, that John would be great in the sight of the Lord, that he would never drink wine or fermented drink, and that he would be filled with the Holy Spirit from birth. And when John grew up, he went into the wilderness. The text simply says, "The child grew and became strong in spirit." and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. The wilderness was his home, his training ground, his sanctuary, under the open sky with endless horizon, with space to breathe and think and pray and become who God called him to be. When he emerged as a force, preaching repentance, baptizing in the Jordan River, drawing crowds from Jerusalem, from all Judea, from the whole region. People came to hear this wild prophet who looked like Elijah reborn, who spoke with authority, who didn't care what anyone thought of him. He called religious leaders a brood of vipers. He told crowds to share their food and clothing with those who had none. He told tax collectors to collect only what was required. He told soldiers to be content with their pay and not extort money. He preached justice, honesty, repentance, preparation for the coming Messiah. And then Jesus came. Jesus, whom John recognized as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus, whom John baptized in the Jordan. Jesus, over whom John saw the Spirit descending like a dove and heard the Father's voice declaring, "This is my beloved Son." John understood his role. He must become greater. I must become less. The forerunner, the voice crying in the wilderness, the one who prepared the way. And now the way was here, standing in the river, and John's main work was done. But John kept preaching, kept baptizing, kept speaking truth. And that's what got him arrested. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, had divorced his wife and married Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. This wasn't just scandalous. It was illegal according to Jewish law. And John said so, publicly, repeatedly. It is not lawful for you to have her. John didn't soften the message for political expediency, didn't calculate the cost of offending power. He just spoke truth, the same way he'd spoken truth to everyone else. Kings weren't exempt from God's law. Power didn't grant permission to sin. Herod's marriage was unlawful, and John said so. Herodias was furious. She nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But Herod was afraid of John. He knew John was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. More than that, Mark's gospel tells us that Herod liked to listen to John, though he was greatly puzzled by what he heard. So Herod's solution was to arrest John and imprison him, remove him from public ministry where he was embarrassing the royal family, but keep him alive because killing a prophet was politically dangerous and personally frightening. John was taken to Macros, a fortress palace on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. It sat on top of a cliff, defensible, isolated, dramatic. Herod had a palace there, rooms for guests, and below carved into the rock dungeons. That's where John went, from the wilderness to a cell. Imagine the transition. John, who'd spent his entire adult life under open sky, was now underground. The man who walked freely across miles of desert was now chained in a space barely large enough to stand or lie down. The prophet who preached to crowds in the open air was now alone in darkness, no sunlight. The cell would have been lit only when guards came with torches, and then only briefly. The rest of the time total darkness. Your eyes adjust, but there's nothing to see. Just stone walls pressing close. No fresh air, just a stale, damp smell of underground spaces. The smell of stone and mold and your own waste because sanitation in ancient dungeons was non-existent. No freedom of movement. Chains rubbed your wrists and ankles raw. You couldn't walk, couldn't stretch fully. Your muscles cramped. Your joints stiffened. Your body, so used to constant movement and physical activity, was forced into immobility, no control over anything. When you ate, what you ate, when you slept, whether you had water, all controlled by guards who might be kind or cruel, depending on their mood and their orders. The food would have been minimal. Scraps from the palace above, maybe. Stale bread, thin gruel, water that might be clean or might not. Enough to keep you alive, but barely. And the psychological torture of confinement. John, whose entire life had been about space and freedom and movement, was now trapped. Every day the same, every night the same. No variety, no stimulation, nothing to do but sit in darkness and think. And what did John think about? We get a glimpse because at some point John sent his disciples to ask Jesus a question. They were allowed to visit him in prison, probably because Herod didn't see them as a threat, and maybe because Herodias hoped they'd bring back information she could use against John. The question John's disciples carried to Jesus: "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" That question from John, the man who'd seen the Spirit descend on Jesus, who'd heard the Father's voice, who'd proclaimed Jesus as the Lamb of God, now asking, "Are you the one? Or should we look for someone else?" Was it doubt? Probably. Prison does that. Isolation does that. When you're sitting in darkness, chained, forgotten, while the person you proclaimed as Messiah is walking free and not doing anything to get you out, doubt creeps in. Or maybe it wasn't doubt about Jesus' identity, so much as confusion about timing. John expected the Messiah to bring judgment. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat into the barn and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire. That's what John preached: judgment, fire, separation. But Jesus was eating with sinners, healing people, teaching about love and mercy, not bringing the judgment John expected. So maybe John was asking, "Are you really the one? Because you're not acting like I thought the Messiah would act." Either way, it was a vulnerable question, an honest question, a question that revealed John's humanity, his struggle, his confusion. Jesus' response was gentle. He didn't rebuke John for asking. He told John's disciples, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Jesus pointed to the prophecies being fulfilled, Isaiah's words coming true. The Messiah was doing exactly what Isaiah said he would do. Maybe not what John expected, but what Scripture promised. And then that last line, "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." A gentle encouragement to John. Keep trusting, even if you don't understand, even if this isn't what you expected. Keep trusting. And after John's disciples left, Jesus spoke to the crowd about John. He praised him extravagantly. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind?" No, John wasn't weak, wasn't swayed by popular opinion or political pressure. A man dressed in fine clothes? No, John wore camel hair and lived simply. Then what did you go out to see, a prophet? Yes, and more than a prophet, the one who prepared the way. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Jesus honored John, defended him, acknowledged his greatness. But John, sitting in his dark cell, didn't hear those words. He just had Jesus' answer to his question, brought back by his disciples, and whatever comfort or confusion that answer brought. Time passed. Days blurred into weeks. John sat in darkness, waited, prayed, maybe wondered if he'd ever get out, maybe made peace with the possibility that he wouldn't. And then came Herod's birthday, a banquet. The powerful and wealthy of Galilee gathered in the palace above, music, laughter, wine flowing freely. Herod getting progressively drunk. Herodias' daughter, Salome, danced for the guests. The dance pleased Herod so much that he made a foolish oath, the kind drunk men make when they're trying to impress people. Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. Whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. The girl went to her mother. What should I ask for? And Herodias, who'd been waiting for this moment, who'd been nursing her grudge, who wanted John dead, the head of John the Baptist. The girl went back immediately and made the request. I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod was deeply distressed. Mark tells us this. He didn't want to kill John, but he'd made an oath in front of all his guests. To refuse would mean losing face. His pride mattered more than John's life. So he sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. Down in the dungeon, John would have heard footsteps approaching. Maybe not unusual guards came periodically, but something about these footsteps was different, faster, more purposeful. The cell door opened, torchlight, a guard with a sword. Did John know immediately what was about to happen? Did he have time to prepare himself, time to pray, or was it too fast? We don't know his last thoughts, his last prayer, his last moments. We just know that he was beheaded, his head placed on a platter, carried back upstairs to a birthday party, presented to a girl who gave it to her mother. Herodias finally got what she wanted. The voice that spoke truth about her sin was silenced. The prophet who wouldn't compromise was dead. John's disciples heard about it. They came to the prison, collected his body, buried it, and went to tell Jesus. John's last days were spent in darkness, in confinement, probably in some doubt, definitely in suffering. The man who'd lived his entire life in freedom died in chains. The voice that cried in the wilderness was silenced in a dungeon. And yet his message didn't die, his impact didn't end. Jesus called him the greatest man born of women. The Gospels all record his ministry, his preaching, his baptism of Jesus. His example of uncompromising truth-telling has inspired people for 2,000 years. John's death showed the cost of being a prophet. It showed that speaking truth to power is dangerous. It showed that faithfulness doesn't guarantee safety or success or even rescue. Sometimes it guarantees suffering and death. But John knew this. He'd always known. When you live in the wilderness, when you speak uncomfortable truth, when you refuse to compromise, you make enemies, powerful enemies. And those enemies can kill you. John accepted that risk. He spoke truth anyway, right up to his arrest, right up to his imprisonment, right up to the end. And in his dark cell, even with doubts, even with confusion, even with suffering, he was still faithful. He sent his disciples to ask Jesus directly rather than giving up on Jesus entirely. He sought understanding rather than abandoning faith. That's what makes John's story so powerful. He wasn't superhuman. He had doubts. He struggled. His faith was tested in the worst possible circumstances, but he held on, asked honest questions, trusted as much as he could, and he died as he lived uncompromising, faithful, pointing others toward the Messiah, even when the Messiah didn't rescue him from prison. John's final days remind us that wilderness living, prophet living, faithful living, it's not safe. It's not comfortable. It doesn't guarantee happy endings by human standards. But it's true, it's real, it matters, and sometimes that's enough. It has to be enough. Everyone knows Moses, the baby in the basket, the prince of Egypt, the man who confronted Pharaoh, the one who parted the Red Sea, the leader who brought Torah down from Mount Sinai. But there's a huge gap in Moses' story that most people skip over. 40 years. 4 entire decades that get maybe a few verses in Exodus. And yet those 40 years were crucial. They transformed Moses from someone spectacularly unqualified to lead to someone who could guide millions through the wilderness for another 40 years. Let's back up. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace. The text tells us he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He had the best education available. He lived in luxury. He had access to power, to resources, to everything Egyptian civilization could offer. But he knew he wasn't Egyptian. He knew he was Hebrew. His own mother had nursed him as a baby. Pharaoh's daughter had unknowingly hired Moses' biological mother as his nurse. So Moses grew up knowing his true identity, knowing his people were enslaved. One day, when Moses was 40 years old, he went out to where his people were working and watched their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Moses looked around, saw no one watching, and killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand. Moses thought he was helping, defending his people, taking the side of the oppressed. But he did it through violence, through murder, through taking justice into his own hands. The next day, Moses saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He tried to intervene. "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man replied, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses' secret was out. People knew, and Moses was afraid. When Pharaoh heard about the murder, he tried to kill Moses, so Moses fled, ran for his life, left Egypt, left the palace, left everything he'd known, and ran into the wilderness. He ended up in Midian, exhausted, alone, with nothing, no plan, no resources, no idea what to do next. He sat down by a well, the ancient equivalent of the town square, where people gathered to draw water. While he was sitting there, 7 daughters of a local priest came to draw water for their father's flocks. Some shepherds showed up and started driving the women away, claiming the well for their own flocks. The shepherds were bullying them, maybe harassing them. Moses stood up and defended the women, helped them water their flocks. His first day as a refugee, and already he was standing up for people being mistreated. It was in his nature. The women went home early. Their father Jethro asked why. They explained, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds." Interesting that they identified Moses as Egyptian. His clothes, his bearing, his appearance still marked him as Egyptian despite his Hebrew birth. Jethro was appalled at their rudeness. Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat. So Moses was brought home, given food, offered hospitality. And somehow the text doesn't give us details. Moses ended up staying. Jethro gave him his daughter Zipporah in marriage. Moses became a shepherd for Jethro's flocks. And he stayed for 40 years. 40 years. Moses went from being a prince in the most powerful empire on earth to being a shepherd in the middle of nowhere, from palaces to tents, from being served to serving, from commanding others to tending stubborn sheep, from civilization to wilderness. It must have been humiliating at first, degrading. Moses had been somebody in Egypt, educated, powerful, important. Now he was nobody, a fugitive. A shepherd, one of the lowest occupations in Egyptian culture. Egyptians considered shepherds detestable, but God was at work in those 40 years, preparing Moses in ways palace education never could. First, Moses learned humility, real humility, not the false humility of rich people play-acting at simplicity, but genuine humility that comes from losing everything and starting over at the bottom. Moses had to learn that he wasn't special, wasn't better than others, wasn't destined for greatness by virtue of his education or upbringing. He was just a man, flawed, broken, dependent on others' kindness for survival. Second, Moses learned the wilderness. For 40 years he led sheep through the desert. He learned where water could be found, which plants were edible, how to predict weather, how to navigate by stars, where predators hunted, which snakes to avoid, how to survive heat and cold and drought and flash floods. Every wilderness skill that he'd later need to lead Israel through that same terrain, he learned it as a shepherd. Third, Moses learned patience. Sheep are stubborn, stupid, prone to wandering. You can't force them, can't rush them. You have to lead them gently, patiently, constantly, or they'll scatter and die. Moses spent 40 years learning to lead creatures that didn't want to be led, that didn't recognize danger, that would walk off cliffs if you didn't watch them constantly. Perfect training for leading Israel, who would prove just as stubborn, just as prone to wandering, just as unable to see danger. Fourth, Moses learned solitude. Shepherds spent long periods alone with their flocks, days, weeks. Just you, the sheep, the wilderness, and the sky. Moses had time to think, to process his past, to deal with his guilt over killing the Egyptian, to grieve the life he'd lost, to let go of who he thought he was and accept who he actually was, to pray, to seek God in the silence. Fifth, Moses learned dependence on God. In the wilderness, you can't depend on yourself alone. You're too vulnerable, too limited, too mortal. You need help beyond yourself. Moses, who'd been raised to think he was powerful, learned that human power is nothing compared to nature's power, to circumstances' power, to God's power. He learned to pray like he meant it, to trust like his life depended on it, because it did. The text tells us Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock and led them to the far side of the wilderness. This wasn't a casual stroll. This was deep wilderness. Moses was comfortable there now. It was his territory, his home. And that's when God appeared in a burning bush, a bush that was on fire but wasn't being consumed by the flames. Moses turned aside to look. He was curious. After 40 years in the wilderness, he knew what was normal and what wasn't. This wasn't normal, so he investigated. And God called to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face. He was afraid to look at God. The palace confidence was long gone. The man who'd killed an Egyptian and buried him, thinking he could fix things through his own power, that man was dead. This Moses knew he was small, mortal, inadequate. God told him the plan. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt. And Moses' response shows how much he'd changed. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? The palace Moses would never have asked that. The palace Moses thought he knew who he was educated, powerful, important. The wilderness Moses knew better. Who am I? I'm nobody. I'm a shepherd. I'm a fugitive. I'm not qualified for this. God's answer, I will be with you. But Moses kept objecting. What if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen? God gave him signs, staff, and a snake, hand leprous, then healed, water into blood. Please, Lord, I'm slow of speech and tongue. God pointed out that he created Moses' mouth, would teach him what to say. Finally, Moses said plainly, Please send someone else. The Lord's anger burned against Moses for that, but God compromised. Your brother Aaron can speak well. He's already on his way. He'll be your spokesman. So Moses went, took his wife and sons, headed back to Egypt after 40 years away. The journey that began with him running for his life ended with him returning to confront the most powerful man in the world, with nothing but his staff and God's word. And everything Moses learned in those 40 years, he needed it all. The humility to let God lead. The wilderness skills to guide Israel through the desert. The patience to deal with constant complaints and rebellion. The experience with solitude to handle being set apart as leader. The dependence on God to sustain him through impossible challenges. When Moses stood before Pharaoh demanding freedom for the Israelites, he wasn't the rash, violent palace prince who'd killed an Egyptian and run. He was a wilderness-forged prophet who knew his own limitations, knew the wilderness intimately, and knew God personally. When Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, through the wilderness to Mount Sinai and beyond, he was walking familiar ground. He'd been there. He knew what to expect. He knew how to find water, find food, find shelter. The wilderness wasn't foreign or frightening. It was his training ground. When Israel complained endlessly, rebelled repeatedly, chose worship of a golden calf over worship of the God who'd freed them, Moses had the patience to keep leading them. 40 years of dealing with stubborn sheep had prepared him for dealing with stubborn people. When Moses climbed Mount Sinai alone to meet with God, he wasn't afraid of solitude. He'd spent decades alone with God in the wilderness. The mountain top was just another place to meet with the one he'd learned to trust. The 40 years nobody talks about were the most important 40 years. They were the curriculum, the training, the preparation. God took a man who thought he could accomplish something through his own power and violence, and spent 4 decades breaking him down and building him back up as someone who knew his own weakness and God's strength. Moses became great not despite those 40 years, but because of them. The wilderness made him. The obscurity shaped him. The humility forged him. The dependence refined him. And here's the beautiful irony. Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace learning to be somebody. Then God sent him to the wilderness for 40 years to learn to be nobody. Only when he was truly nobody, when all the palace polish had worn off, when all the human confidence had died, when he knew beyond doubt that he was inadequate only, then was he ready for God to use him. The 40 years in Midian were 40 years of death. Death to the old Moses. Death to pride, death to self-sufficiency, death to the idea that he could accomplish anything of lasting value through his own power. But they were also 40 years of life in learning to trust God, life in discovering his true identity, not as a prince, but as a servant, life in finding that the wilderness, which looked like exile and punishment, was actually God's grace preparing him for his true calling. When Moses finally stood before Pharaoh, he stood there as a wilderness man, and pharaohs, with all their power and wealth and armies, couldn't intimidate someone who'd already been broken and rebuilt in the wilderness, couldn't threaten someone who'd already lost everything and found that God was enough. The 40 years nobody talks about made Moses into Moses, made the deliverer ready to deliver, made the leader ready to lead, made the prophet ready to speak for God. And those 40 years teach us something crucial. Sometimes what looks like wasted time, like detour, like exile, like punishment, that's actually God's preparation. The wilderness seasons when nothing seems to be happening, when you feel forgotten, when your gifts seem wasted, those might be the times God is doing the deepest work in you, breaking down what needs to break, building up what needs to build, preparing you for something you can't even imagine yet. Moses couldn't have known, while tending sheep in Midian, that he was training to lead a nation through the wilderness. He probably thought his life was over, that his chance to make a difference had passed, that he'd spend the rest of his days in obscurity. But God knew. God was at work, and when the time was right, God called him from the bush and said, Now you're ready. Now I can use you, not because you're powerful, but because you know you're not. Not because you're confident, but because you know to depend on me. Not despite the wilderness, but because of it. That's the story of Moses' 40 years that nobody talks about, and it might be the most important part of his story. So here we are. We've walked through the wilderness together, felt the hunger, the thirst, the cold nights on stone, faced the predators, endured the loneliness, fought the spiritual battles, understood why prophets looked the way they did. We've sat with Elijah in his depression cave, feeling the weight of someone who'd given everything and felt it wasn't enough. We've been with John in his dark cell, facing death after a life of freedom. We've followed Moses through 40 years of preparation that looked like exile. And if you're still awake, though it's perfectly fine if you've drifted off, you might be thinking about how different their lives were from ours, how hard, how brutal, how utterly beyond what most of us could endure. And you'd be right. You wouldn't last a day as a prophet in the wilderness. Neither would I, neither would most people. The physical demands alone would break us. The hunger would drive us home. The first cold night would send us running back to civilization. The loneliness would crush our spirits within weeks. But here's what's beautiful about these stories. The prophets didn't last because they were superhuman. They lasted because God sustained them. They were broken, doubtful, scared, lonely, hungry, hurting people who kept going because something bigger than themselves kept pulling them forward. They teach us that God doesn't always call us to comfort. Sometimes God calls us to hard places, to wilderness places, to situations that strip away everything we thought we needed and leave us with only what actually matters. They teach us that when we feel weak, inadequate, overwhelmed, we're in good company. Moses felt that way. Elijah felt that way. John felt that way. And God used them anyway. Used them powerfully. made their weakness the platform for divine strength. They teach us that preparation sometimes looks like exile, that the times when we feel forgotten might be the times God is doing the deepest work in us, that wilderness seasons, as painful as they are, can forge us into people we could never become in comfort. Most of us won't be called to literal wilderness, won't have to survive on locusts and wild honey, won't sleep on stone in predator territory, won't spend years in physical isolation, but we all face wilderness seasons of other kinds, times of loss, times of waiting, times when God seems silent and nothing makes sense, times when we're stripped of what we relied on and left with only faith, times when we have to choose between comfort and calling, between what's easy and what's right. And in those times the prophets speak to us, not from positions of strength, but from their own weakness, not with easy answers, but with honest struggle, not promising that faith makes everything comfortable, but showing that faith sustains us through the uncomfortable. So rest now. Let these stories settle into your mind and heart. Let them remind you that struggle doesn't mean failure. That doubt doesn't mean abandonment. That needing help doesn't mean weakness. The prophets survived because they learned to depend on God completely, to trust when they couldn't see, to obey even when it cost everything, to speak truth even when no one wanted to hear it. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Not comfortable, not easy, but enough. May you rest well tonight. May your dreams be gentle. May you wake tomorrow knowing that whatever wilderness you're walking through, you don't walk alone. The same God who sustained prophets in impossible places is with you in yours. Peace to you. Rest well. Good night.